Welcome, everybody, to the Couple Nurses Podcast with your host, Matt Sartrick, and myself, Peter Findera. This is a podcast where I tackle current health news and hot nursing topics, one conversation at a time. Thank you guys for tuning in on this beautiful Friday. Hope you guys are having a great Friday. Hope you're off from work. Hope you could chill out for the weekend. But first of all, I want to say thank you for following us. Thank you for commenting, subscribing. But make sure to give us the 5 stars on our podcast. Make sure to drop a comment as well. Don't forget to check out us on YouTube. We got those vlogs coming out weekly. A lot of cool stuff on our grams. So thank you guys. And then one more time, Patreon is coming soon. What's up, Matt? What are we talking about today?
Hey, PD, how are you? Before I start the show, I want to ask 2 questions to keep in mind. How do you define death? And how comfortable do you feel with death? And in today's episode, we're going to talk about patient death, how to cope with a death of a loved one, maybe a death of a patient, and post-mortem care, which is not talked about a lot, but we do deal with it a lot in the ICU.
In the ICU, you might get a little bit like desensitized to death for the most part. Some people might not remember their first patient dying. I vaguely remember my first patient dying, but I remember majority of those situations. I'm not saying it happens every day. I'm not saying it happens every week, but in ICU, unfortunately, you deal with a lot of sick people, and the ultimate result is eventually death.
Yeah, you're right. And I started off in med-surg, so I remember my first death pretty vivid, dealing with my first patient. It was like change of shift, and it was Christmas Eve, so it was just very tragic to deal with that and then sit down with my family and tell them about it. It was interesting. It's like never have I ever imagined being the last person on like somebody's chest to beating them down, or like that time you just come into the room, you're getting a report and the charge nurse is screaming your name at almost change of shift, something's going on, patient's going down the gutter, or 3 hours down, everything was good, and just it's wild. And it's wild, and it's yes, it's desensitizing, and it's you have to learn how to compartmentalize sometimes with everything that's happening, because it's a lot.
Yeah, and not every death in a hospital or in the ICU is going to be due to a cold. There are people that pass away as DNRs, and we just let them pass away peacefully. Not necessarily in a hospice yet because they're still in the ICU, but if they happen to pass on your shift, then that's what ends up happening. It's not always like Matt said, it's not always going to be like a cold situation where you're on someone's chest, and then every death is occurring after a cold, where you do compression, do ACLS protocol for 20, 30 minutes, and then you call it, right? And the patient dies. It's not always like that. There's people that pass away with family around them, except during these C-19 times might be a little more complicated. But back in the normal days, you could call it, is patients would pass normally in ICU with their family around them, with the whole you can see the whole grieving process of how certain family members take it differently, how certain family members grieve compared to others, and you get the full-blown experience, not always on someone's chest, but with someone actually on a morphine drip or a Lada drip, going every hour to make it comfortable, and then you actually see them pass, and you have the alarms off at that point, and you literally see the heart rate go from 60s, 40s, 30s, 20s, then you see a few agonal beats, and that's pretty much it. And they pass calmly and peacefully without all this intense cardiac arrest, ACLS protocol going on. There's people that actually in a hospital peacefully.
And that's when you print out your EKG strip of asystole. You call the resident, the physician, whoever, to declare the patient, they passed away. But I think what you described is the death of the patient is the family dynamic that's never really talked about. And nursing school never prepares you for this, because no book can tell you how to deal with a death of a patient, but on top of that, to deal with the family, which is a whole different dynamic. It's never talked about, and it takes a lot of emotions, and it kind of weighs you down sometimes differently. And that's the biggest change also with C-19 is we don't deal with that as much. It's different. It's over the phone. Because before, you had to be very intuitive to figure out how a family is going to react based on culture and stuff like that.
There's always 3 perspectives in a room with a dying patient. You're going to have, or I don't know if you call perspectives or entities, but there's 1, the patient, there's you, the nurse, and the medical professionals, and then there's 3 is the family. And it's interesting, we're all going through this process of the patient dying, but we all come at it from different perspectives, right? The one patient is dying. You don't know what he's going through exactly because, he's probably on a morphine drip. He can't talk, he can't move, he can't make his needs known. Just make it comfortable, right? As a nurse, you have your own perspective in that sense, being that if this is in your first death, then it's going to be a little bit less emotional, you could say. But some nurses always have the same emotions with dying patients. But let's just say this is your first death. You have your own experience, right? So the things that you go through as a nurse, and if you experience a patient dying a few times, a lot of things that go through your head are, one is going to be, when is this patient gonna die? Basically, like you kind of estimate it, right? Like you guys say, I think this patient's holding on pretty strongly. It might be a few days, or hey, this patient isn't doing like the best, and you're kind of guessing that he's probably gonna pass on your shift. So when you think a patient's gonna pass on your shift, your next thought process is going to be, how do I tell the family that hey, that you think that the patient is dead? Because the monitors are there, and the patient's family is going to see all the monitors read 0 at some point, right? So they're going to know, hey, something's up, right? But then you have to be the one, if this goes in there, be like, hey, I'm going to call the chaplain, or I'm going to get the intensivist or the house physician, because your loved one has no pulse, it's not breathing. It seems like he has passed away, right? It's always nerve-wracking saying that statement, even though the family is kind of aware for the most part because everything's reading 0. Them getting that news brings up a whole dynamic and a whole different slew of emotions, right? So that's kind of what's going on in your head, and you got to deal with the family. And then after that, after you finally tell them what's going on, then you have to kind of assist them, right? So you kind of want to get them the box of tissues, you want to answer any of the questions, you kind of want to. It's gonna be hard to make them feel happy, but you're gonna try to make them feel comfortable, right? So they're gonna be asking you a bunch of different questions. They might ask you if you're religious or what is your religious background. You could feel free to share whatever you want. They're gonna ask you a bunch of questions. It just always is. Like, what are the next things to do? Do I gotta call our church? Things like that, where you'll learn to answer them as you go, and then you gotta do a bunch of paperwork and all that. But that's kind of in a back burner. And like I said, there's two perspectives. So the patient, we explained, that doesn't even know what's going on because we don't know what's going on because they're dying. 2 is yourself, and 3 is the family. So the family's going to have the most intense feelings ever because they've known this patient for the longest, and that this person's going to be out of their life forever. And that's probably the one they have the most difficult, I guess, emotions to kind of figure out, and a most difficult task out of everybody for the most part. Actually, now I think about it, nurse has it pretty hard and like a job perspective, a career role, but in like a normal social perspective, definitely family has definitely a lot higher and tougher dynamic to deal with.
Of course. And like, even though the patient is on comfort care, let's just say it's taken them like 3 days to pass away, they're on the morphine drip, and the family's checking up, or, pre C19, they were in the rooms, every day, coming in, leaving, and we were calling them, giving them updates. Even though that patient passed away, you let them know, it still hits them differently, and they still react, even though they had these 2-3 days to prepare. And yeah, it's tough. It's hard to deal with it. And if I had to give like someone like one piece of advice, I think the best thing to do sometimes is to be silent, because I love to talk, right? I could always just go in there and like say something, and like I tend to talk, and sometimes at a bad situation, it's better just to practice silence, because no matter what you tell that patient, they like grieving is like alone, being an how would I say it, like a journey on its own. You're alone on that journey of grieving. No one can help you but yourself. So sometimes just practicing silence in sad situations is best to do.
Yeah, it's pretty hard, especially if you're talking to the family like a lot, if they're in that room every day and you saw them every day, then you do want to say something, but it's not always the best time to say something. Sometimes you got to keep your mouth shut. I'm not saying you're gonna say anything bad, but sometimes the family doesn't want your opinion. They're not gonna tell you they don't want your opinion. They're not gonna show it or anything like that. But all they want is somebody just to be quiet and just to kind of listen. Like, let them talk. You shouldn't be talking more than them. It should be them, because they're not at that point in time. They might be asking you questions and things like that. So like, answer them like short, sweet, and to the point, because like Matt said, they're there to grieve over their loved one.
Yeah.
And last thing you want, imagine if you being them, where you're grieving over your loved one, and then you have this nurse bombarding you with questions, just trying to prove a point or trying to make a statement, it's gonna be bothersome, right? You're trying to grieve over your loved one, right?
Yo,
That's
ice
good.
cream truck is bumping right
Yeah, I
now,
know, right?
guys.
What a timing, right?
Yeah, it's like 70 degrees in California, so
Hmm.
all right, good stuff. Anyways, also I want to mention like yeah, cluster your care, right? When like the family comes in and they're like in the room and you already did the post-mortem care, just go in there, ask them the questions if you're gonna have that form to fill out, like where do they want the body to be released to, correct? It usually goes on to the morgue to security. They either release it to a funeral home, they write that down, or if they don't know that information currently, give them a number to call security so then they could call and figure out the funeral home where the body is going to be released and let them like continue the grieving
Mm.
process. And
Yeah.
you don't need to come in there either and just like, hey, do you need anything? If they need something, they'll come out. Make sure they have tissue. Make sure to get that like friendly cart sometimes that the cafeteria provides, the goodies tray, I would
Mm.
say, and just let them do their thing for a
Mm.
couple hours.
Yeah, and since you brought up postmortem care, we could probably touch upon some postmortem care. Besides the paperwork part, it's different for per facility, so we're not gonna get into depth with that one. Like, I'm not sure how they do it in our hospital right now, but I did it a few times in my prior hospital. But the main thing as like a nurse that's gonna be universal is basically allowing time with the family and their loved one that just passed away. Obvious, right? But it's also gonna compose of getting the patient washed up, and especially like if you just got done with the code and then they pronounced it after the code, that patient is gonna be pretty messy, right? There's gonna be stuff all over
Yeah,
the room.
caps and
Yeah,
stuff and needles.
right. Blood. The patient's probably gonna might be in poop, might be soil, things like that. You want to clean them up, especially after the code. But in general, you just want to get the patient cleaned up, make them look nice. Wash their face. Close their mouth so it's not wide open,
Yeah.
things like that. And
Put
you
some
want to,
glasses on.
if it has glasses, put some glasses on. If they have a rosary in the room or like just a kind of family thing that he always had with him, you put that in his hand, things like that. And you also want to give a new gown, change the linen, make it look neat, boost them up. You're gonna want to D-line the patient.
Yeah, so that includes the ET
Mm,
tube. If they had like central lines, take out the PIC, take out the Foley. If they have
yeah,
a suprapubic catheter, I would deflate the balloon, take that out. Just
yeah.
make sure the patient's like, and it's how damn that's deep, and it's like not prime
Natural.
natural state. Yeah,
Yeah. The only probably iffy thing is usually A lines. Those if you have a patient with an A line and you're D-lining him, might want to do that line first because that line for me always tends to bleed. And
yeah,
there was a situation where I had a patient that passed away. I held pressure on an A line and I wrapped it up tightly and all that jazz you're supposed to do. And 3 hours later, I come in and there's blood everywhere. And I'm just like, shit, dude. Like this family's grieving over here, and this guy has like almost a giant pool of blood. So then I had to clean him up and things like that. So just be careful for those A lines. Central lines don't really give me any trouble with bleeding. It's more of the arterial accesses that do it.
yeah. And the next thing you want to do is put the patient in an actual bag that comes with the hospital, and you want to make sure you tag them so you
Mm.
get the patient identifiers. Every hospital does it differently, right? You get usually three tags, one on the toe, one in the bag, and like one in the zipper or whatever. And you call security, whoever, to escort the body to where designated area.
Yeah. And then gift of hope too as well. So if they were an organ donor or if they didn't qualify as an organ donor for certain organs, a lot of times they could still keep the sclera of the eyes or even the skin. So if they have for donation the sclera of their eye, you want to put like a moist piece of gauze on their eyes, or like some people have, or some places have like just like these moist pads that they put on the eyes just so you can
Yeah.
save it, because those are going to be up for donation. And if let's say a patient is at the brink of death, for the most part, I'm not sure how each hospital does it, but I'm pretty sure majority of hospital require you to call Gift of Hope or something, or some kind of organ donation hotline
So
to
yeah,
let them know, right?
that process is usually going to start when the patient's like really critical.
Mm.
Sometimes if like you got a patient on like 3, 4 pressors, things aren't looking good. You already calling Gift of Hope, and they're doing all that if they're a candidate. So yeah, it depends on the scenario, but definitely when the patient passes away, that's like usually your second time following up with Gift of Hope. I forgot what company it's here, Lifeline or someone in the West Coast. I'm not too sure, but every single facility is going to have its own agency to technically reach out to, right? I don't know if
Mm.
it's government or private. Who knows?
Uh,
I think
it's
it's
probably.
private,
You
but
think so? You think ordination is private? I don't know.
Gift of hope. Sure. Who
Yeah,
knows?
but yeah, you're supposed to call them either way just to let them know, hey, patient, this and so has passed away, just so they have it clear on their records. And dude, Gift of Hope and all these organ donation agencies or whatever you want to call them, like they do a solid job. Like imagine being a nurse that has a patient that's on, like you said, three pressers, and there's really no hope, and Gift of Hope is involved. Imagine if it was your job to
Reach out
ask
to
the
the
family,
family.
yeah, reach out to the family and ask, hey, do you think your loved one would be okay to give their organs when they die? Like, dude, you know how hard that question is to ask?
Hell yeah.
They probably have a really stressful job. Those nurses or people that have to ask the family the question if they want their loved one's organs to be donated.
Especially like death is usually not talked about. So they're talking about death
Mm,
and organ donation. It's
right.
like, damn.
Yeah, it's like, hey, my loved one isn't even dead, and you already asked for their organs. It sounds kind of shitty. Like, hey, my
It sounds shady.
right, like my dad didn't pass away, and you already want his heart, his liver, and his kidney. Like what? But like, unfortunately, that's the only time we could ask them, because if they do decide to donate these
We
organs,
have to preserve it.
yeah, it's preserve it. So it's like a whole different process of like preservation. So it's a whole different prep, because you wanna keep these organs, well fed and with a proper blood supply, and you want to get them out of the body as soon as you can into another body as soon as you can, right?
Yeah, that actually would be very cool. A podcast episode like talking about Gift of Hope, what they do. Like usually the patients they like extubate them and they have to wait by the OR. If their heart doesn't stop within 90 minutes, the organs aren't considered good anymore, and they just go back up to like hospice care upstairs, like
Mm.
on the floor. It's like it's pretty damn
Yeah.
gnarly.
It's intense because Kamil, the guy that we had on, our buddy Kamil, we had about one of his episodes. He actually did a few Gift of Hope operations, so it's pretty cool.
Damn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how that dynamic is. That'd be pretty cool to talk about.
I know here at this hospital they do like a special ceremony where the family lines up, physicians line up, and all the nursing team lines up, and they actually like not escort, but they stand by the door and have like the patient wheel through in between them, like a kind of like a ceremony.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's yeah.
Everyone
That's
pays like the respect, like like this patient that potentially could save like four or
few
five people.
people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's crazy.
it's very heroic.
Yeah.
And another tip I would give for like, dealing with patient dying and stuff like that is this is more for yourself. Don't play the blame game. So normally after like a crazy situation, now let's just go into like the code part, right? You're usually always going to be second guessing yourself. Like, what could I have done, that could have been differently? Like my first time, like my patient was on a sand bed, and like before the patient coded, we usually turned the patient. She defecated. She had a giant BM, and like after the patient like coded, like the nurse is like, yeah, usually after like patient has a giant bowel movement like that, they could code because they like lose like what is it, osmotic pressure or something like that, and the pressure drops. I was like, it made me feel shitty. Like, damn, could this all been prevented? But like, there's no need for that. Don't play the blame game. It's just like part of life, part of nature. That nature did its course. Technically, as bad as it sounds, and usually in these harmful situations, it's our own human, I don't know, like behavior programming to want to second guess. Just accept it for what it is.
Yeah, we drill it a bunch of times during our podcast. Is you can't always control the outcomes, no matter how hard you try, no matter what you do for the patient, no matter how hard you want them to live, no matter you do everything per protocol perfectly executed, that patient still might die. And like Matt said, you can't play the blame game. It's not your fault. It's just the human body taking this course, and that's just how things are. Some people live, some people die, some people regenerate perfectly after the code. Some people don't make it through the code. It's just part of life.
Yeah.
When it's time to go, it's unfortunately time to go. You call it religious, call it genetic, call it whatever you want, but at a certain point, we reach this level where no matter what we do, we're not gonna prevent anything. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sometimes we got to take a loss. And that's why we say, like, you need those self care days. And that goes into, like, might as well just get into, practicing self care. So, like, how to deal with the death of a patient. The first thing is, like, self care. Like, you need the time for yourself, that balance. Just like we say, find a hobby, find something that you could, like, de stress on and, take, that energy away from, like, that negative environment.
There's no like protocol for how to deal with a patient death. There's no book or a little hand guide. Step one, do this. Step two, do that. Step three, sleep. Step four, go talk about this with somebody. It's not like that. It's not that easy. Everyone has different emotions, and different emotions come up in different ways, different situations, and we just have to kind of learn from our own experience. The way Matt deals with a patient dying is gonna be different from the way I deal with patient dying, right? Same thing goes with the way a hospice nurse deals with patient dying compared to a new grad, right?
Yeah.
Completely different. It's something that we keep saying this, like you get desensitized to it, but that's kind of like that's that's like a kind of, you could say, a shallow way to look at it, but for some people might think that. I don't, because that's just like the truth for it. I'm not gonna sugarcoat anything. It's just you get desensitized to it because it happens so often where you kind of already know what to do. It's almost like robotic, but the work is robotic. The postmortem care is pretty robotic, but the thing that always changes is the family aspect of it. You're always gonna approach a family different than the next one, right? Because some family members seek different things. Same way you talk to the patient's sister differently compared to the way you would talk to their brother, right?
I would also mention, because you said like robotics. So like let's just say your patient just like passes away and the doctor calls a code, right? You do have that like moment of grief where everybody looks at each other in the eyes, looks around the room. We know we did a fabulous job. Everybody, did their hard work. Unfortunately, this is what happened, and we have that moment of grief. Like we still we still accept these emotions. Like we don't like just like suffocate them. Like, oh, like dying is part of the world. Let it be, right? Like we still accept those emotions in that given moment. We grieve, but we put it aside because it's just, you can't do anything else with it. You could grieve forever. You just have to accept it, right, and just move on with your shift in a way, and that becomes easier. But you still are going to experience that emotion. It's up to you to choose how long you want to experience them.
It's crazy. For every patient that has died, like not necessarily on me, but like died just like in a hospital where like I've seen pass away, right? Like I always have like this moment where I mean, I always get it. I don't know why it just happens where it's just like not really like not really. Well, I'll put it this way. So basically, I get like this emotion where it's like one day this could be me, not necessarily like in that person's situation, but like dying, right?
Yeah, of
I always
course.
have that kind of like a feeling, and then I always take a deep breath, and then while I'm doing like postmortem care, even though I'm not the most religious person, I always say like a little prayer in my head, and like hope that the family remembers that patient for his good times, not necessarily his bad. Just a little protocol that I do for myself, and that's kind of how I always work with it, and it's just like I want to say I've seen maybe like 7 to 10 deaths. I want to say these past like 4 years almost, and basically do that little protocol each time,
Yeah,
and
it's
like it's
really
not like
cool.
I don't like it just happens subconsciously, like I just go through like those phases, and it's just I'm just like damn, did it again. Like I catch myself,
Yeah,
I'm like damn, I'm doing it again.
that
But
that's
it's
that's
pretty
your way
interesting.
of kind of dealing with things.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Well, yeah, but another tip that we could offer you guys for kind of dealing with death, besides like practicing self-care, that's probably the most important one out of all of them. But you know, it's also okay to kind of feel relaxed or almost happy that the patient has passed away, because there's been too many times where we've seen patients struggling in a hospital for months at a time with
We talk about this a lot.
yeah, and we know there's literally no hope, but the family keeps saying, keeps pushing, keeps pushing, keeps pushing, and you know that the patient's struggling because you're doing sedation occasion, you're trying to extubate him, and his patient's like hanging on by a thread. You don't want to be too aggressive because you know that the patient is gonna die, so you're being aggressive enough to meet the family's needs, but you're not being aggressive to the point where basically your strong action, strong push, strong process is gonna end up, I want to say killing the patient, but push them too far.
And we could both right now say that we know a patient right now in the ICU that like is going through something like that.
Yeah.
And when that patient, passes away, God forbid, I'm gonna feel a little bit joyful in a way because
Mm,
that patient went through a lot of suffering, taking care of him, putting a dub hoff in his nose, you know what I mean, turning him and seeing him in excruciating pain.
mm,
It's gonna be a sense of relief to see that person in another, state of consciousness, right? Let's just
mm,
say that. And the mother beginning her grieving period because she finally made peace with like the situation, because if you were to look at the dynamic, the patient is, very sick, and the mom is holding on for dear life because she's thinking there's a way for, all this to go away. So yeah, it's a joyful moment because two people are going through a different part of life now.
It's relaxing. Like you seeing somebody. There's a difference between seeing somebody pass away naturally with like family in agreement, being okay with the process, and then there's another feeling that you get when you know the patient's family is forcing on it way too much for the patient. You kind of know that the patient would not want this,
Yeah.
but the family has the last say, and that's kind of what's going to be, because you do, like, we don't know what happens after we die, right? We don't
Such a freaking mystery.
right? We don't. If maybe there's people out there that do, that they don't want to tell anybody, but I don't, and I'm sure as hell Matt doesn't, because if he knew, then we'd be in a whole different situation.
Yeah, we would tell you probably.
Yeah, and then the fact of the matter is, we don't know what the hell's gonna happen when we die. It could be another life, a longer life. We could get reincarnated. We could go to heaven. We could just, it could, as far as I know, it could just be nothing. That's it.
Yeah.
That's a pretty scary thing to think about. It could be basically nothing. This is it. This is your one shot. It's one chance. But it's not the point. Like, the thing is,
We're about
like,
to turn this podcast episode to what is life?
right. The thing is, like, it's okay to feel happy. Don't feel weird. Like don't be like, why am I happy this patient died? Because it is a natural occurrence. People are going to die. You can't stop that. And like, feeling happy is like a normal instinct. Like, I felt happy for a few patients that passed away, because I know that they passed away already, and they passed away the way they wanted to, like calm and peaceful, without any conflict or anything like that. And that's really rare to see.
And that's one of those things, as a nurse, you always want to advocate. Sometimes you advocate for the wrong things, but you accept the wishes of the patient and stuff like that, and things go on. And that goes into like the next thing, like, remember, like, that these things happen. Just give your most attention to it, most compassion, and learn to compartmentalize the situation and feel that emotion, and just kind of like move on. That's like the best advice I would have for anybody out there listening.
But you can't be that person that says, "Oh, well, if it happens, it happens." Like,
Of
like,
course.
you can't have that kind of perspective and personality either, because that's kind of like, I want to say weird, but it's not something you should have as like a nurse. Like carefree, whatever happens. Death is normal. Yeah, it passed away. Who cares? You're gonna pass away too. Everyone's gonna pass away eventually. That's kind of not the right. If you can have that perspective, that's fine. It's whatever you want to do with it, but it's not a good idea to kind of show that around the family.
Yeah,
You could show that around like your coworkers and all that. That's fine. But patient care wise, like, when someone's dying, you should for sure, not kind of, you should 100% accommodate to the patient's needs.
yeah, meet their energy. in a way.
Exactly. And if they're religious, you don't have to be religious, but just don't laugh at whatever they're doing. Don't make fun of them if they're singing or whatever, because they're different religious subgroups that maybe they view death as joyful, right? So they might be singing, family might be happy. Don't be like, oh, there's a bunch of loonies singing and dancing over their uncle's dead body. No, it's just the way they express themselves during like a death of a loved one.
Yeah, when I say remember that it happens, it's more about that blame game with like nurses, like that blame game that kind of takes over. I would also say that, like, sometimes we also, like, we as like nurses, because we kind of like mess around and joke around and stuff, like, don't forget, like, if a patient passes away there, like, just kind of keep it down for a little bit, for an hour or two. Be respectful of it. Like, of course, you're running the unit and stuff like that. I could do whatever I want, but just be respectful for that little time being. So when that family member comes around, it's like you're just meeting their energy and their atmosphere for now, because that's what they need. That's what they need at that moment.
And also remember that you're making a difference. Yeah, the patient might have died. It sucks. It's very sad. It's very hard. But just know that everything that you did during that shift or during the patient care it doesn't go to waste just because the patient died. Like, this is a lot of things that we nurses do go unnoticed, but realize that, like, the energy that you provided in that room to that patient, like, that's being broadcasted somewhere, and eventually it's gonna come back to you. Like, I'm not saying like karma, things like that, whatever you want to believe in, but like,
Universe.
just because it goes unseen and unnoticed doesn't mean it doesn't count for anything, right? At least if nobody sees you do a good job, like, you as a person know you did a good job, and you cared, that should be enough to make you happy.
Like, yeah, I'm that nurse. Hey, I go in there, I give them 100, and that's all that matters, right?
Yeah, because let's say you do something extra each time, just because you don't get noticed each time you do something extra, guess what? That one time out of 100 when you do get noticed, you're gonna feel a lot better.
Oh yeah.
Right? And especially, like, family might not remember you during like the patient's most critical time. So they might not remember you hanging pressers. They might not remember you running around the room. But what they will remember of you is you helping them through the grieving process. You taking care of their loved one when he passed away. You being there when he literally passed away. That's what they remember you for. They're not gonna remember you doing like all this technical nursing stuff where you're calculating drips, hanging one, discontinuing the other, giving fluids. They're not gonna remember you for that because they don't know what the hell's going on. But they will remember you when you talk to them when their loved one passed away, when you say, I'm sorry for your loss, when you say, is there anything I can help you with? Why? Because they can relate to you in that kind of level. They can't relate to you when you're hanging drips.
It's just like the patient that you just like ran around, called the doctor for, like you caught an error that could have potentially like, caused some harm to them, yet you forgot to bring them their tea and they're freaking kind of shitting on you for that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's the stuff that gets unnoticed. But just know that you're amplifying this goodness into the world, and it'll come back in one form or the other if you believe in that. I really do believe whatever you put out to the universe, you kind of get it back. That's just kind of how like the law of attraction works, right? We just talked about.
Yeah. And a fifth tip for you guys, another good one, probably second self-care, but also goes along with self-care is talk about it. Like if your first patient death was detrimental to you, like the best thing you could do is use your nurses, use your coworkers to talk about it, because they've been in your shoes more times than you, especially if you're a new grad and your first time experiencing death. Well, guess what? If you experience death for the first time, let's say 1 month into being a nurse, imagine how many times the other nurses around you have experienced it, right? And you guys for sure have the same emotions because nurses, we all have similarities, right?
Yeah.
And we all are similar on some type of level, and we don't shut down anyone's emotion. If a nurse came up to you that's having a hard time processing the death of the patient, even though it might be easier for you and you kind of know how to do it personally, you're not going to give shitty advice. You're going to try to be there as much as you can to help the nurse because you understand when your patient died, you understand how we're not very emotional people. I mean, we're dudes. We're not the most emotional guys in the world.
Even though most of our listeners are females. So maybe this is our struggle instead, right?
Yeah, but like you could understand why this nurse is emotional, right?
Of
like
course.
Just because you didn't feel his emotions, you understand because we're pretty intellectual and pretty
we're empathetic. We're able to feel too.
Right? And our people like with people persons. Does that make sense? Or peoples? I don't know which way you would say that.
Sounds good either way, man.
Right, but like just because you don't experience those emotions, you kind of have an idea how those emotions would feel, right? So you're able to give advice. You're able to be empathetic to that nurse that's coming to you for advice from a dying patient. You don't just close her off and say, well, I've seen 4 deaths and I got through a fine. You'll be okay tomorrow. Like you wouldn't say that, right? You would say you offer some advice relating to her emotional issues, right?
Yeah, that's like the worst thing that people hate is also like you telling somebody, and instead of them acknowledging your feelings and maybe saying something, they're just like, well, they try to fix you right away. That's not good either. And that's what's so cool about having coworkers is they understand your kind of vibe. For the travel nurses out there, let's just say you're kind of lone wolfing it on the unit, just call one of your nurse friends or somebody that you could talk to, on that kind of emotional level to just kind of vent a little bit, just so they could hear you out. Because I know sometimes with travel nursing, you tend to kind of be, lonely for some time.
And if you guys feel lonely or whatever, or don't feel like you have anyone to talk to at work or are kind of shy to open up like in person, like you could shoot us a message or whatever. I mean, we'll try to get back to it as soon as we can, but
we're not the best at it sometimes.
Yeah, we do get busy sometimes, but if you need some words to get your feelings out about a patient dying or anything at work, like I said, shoot us a message and we'll try to help you through it, things like that, because it's a lot harder to kind of look a coworker in the eyes for like the first time, especially as a travel nurse, and say, hey, I feel really sad about my patient dying. Like, Can we talk? Like, that's like very personal, right? Compared to like sending a text message to your friend, like, hey, I had a patient die, I feel like shit. That's a lot easier to do because you're not there one-on-one physically with somebody. Exactly. It's easier to send over a message,
I agree with you, man. I think this is a great wrap up.
Thank you for tuning in. Give you a great spiel about how to deal with death and dying of a patient. We actually give you 5 tips on how to work your way through patient death or the dying process. We offered you a little bit of insight on post-mortem care.
And practicing silence and stop blaming yourself is a way to help you cope with that.
Take care, guys.
Peace, guys. Next week.